The stars outside the viewport did not move. They never moved, not really, but Commander Nathan Cole had spent enough years standing at enough viewports to know that the stillness was a kind of lie. Everything in space was moving. Everything was always moving. It was only distance that made it look like nothing was happening at all. Cole was 54 years old. He was lean in the way that men get lean when they stop thinking about their bodies and start thinking about everything else. His hair had gone silver 3 years ago, somewhere between the shipyard inspections above Titan and the first full power test of the Iron Meridian's drive system. He had not noticed a change until a young ensign asked him, very politely, if he had always had silver hair or if something had happened. He told the ensign that something had always been happening. That was the only answer that made sense. The Iron Meridian held its position at the edge of the fold corridor in silence. It was a big ship. It was the biggest ship that human beings had ever built, and Cole had been aboard it long enough that he sometimes forgot this until he watched something move past one of the external cameras, a supply drone, a maintenance shuttle, once a small comet fragment that wandered too close on its long loop around the outer system, and realized that the thing he was watching looked like a toy next to the hull. 4 kilometers from bow to stern, wide enough across the midsection that 2 of the largest naval vessels from a previous century could have parked side by side inside the main weapons bay with room to spare. The ship had been built above Titan, in the orbital construction yards of the United Earth Federation had quietly expanded over 11 years while telling the rest of the galaxy that the expansion was for commercial freight. It was not for commercial freight. Everyone who needed to know had known that, and they had kept the secret the way good engineers keep secrets, by working instead of talking. The Iron Meridian was the result of that work. It was a result of late shifts and cold coffee and arguments over hull tolerances and drive configurations and arguments about the arguments, and finally the long, silent morning when the last external panel had been locked into place and construction chief, a woman named Lou Garrett from Beaumont, Texas, had looked at what they had made and said that she needed to sit down for a minute. Cole remembered that morning. He had been standing with her on the observation platform. He had not said anything either. Some things did not need words, and what they were looking at was one of those things. Now the ship sat at the fold corridor threshold and waited for Cole's order, and Cole stood at the bridge viewport and said nothing for a while longer. So, Lieutenant Carrie Sumner's voice came from the sensor station behind him. She had a way of saying that single word that gave it exactly as much weight as the situation required, no more and no less. Cole had noticed this in the first week of the mission, and had quietly decided that Sumner was going to be running her own ship someday, if she wanted one. Council advanced scouts have us on long-range sensors. They have been tracking us for the last 40 minutes. What are they reading? Hard to say exactly. Their scan resolution at this range isn't good enough to give them a full picture. They know something is in the corridor. They don't know what. Cole nodded slowly. This was the part of the plan that he liked. Not the arrival, the approach. The moment before, the Council scouts had been positioned at the edge of the Velian expanse for 2 weeks, watching for the human delegation. They had been watching for a diplomatic shuttle. They had protocols for diplomatic shuttles. They had procedures and checklists and a lower gallery behind glass where human representatives sat when they were summoned to answer for something, and the whole structure of the thing was designed around humanity being exactly what the Council had always believed it was, a minor species, a small noise, a technical problem to be administered rather than a power to be dealt with. The scouts were going to keep believing that until they couldn't anymore. Cole intended to give them as long as possible to hold on to that belief, because the moment it broke was going to be instructive for everyone involved. "Continue scanning," he said. "Don't respond to any hails until we are within direct visual range of the station." "Understood." "And Sumner, keep the emissions profile low. I don't want active targeting systems. I don't want anything that reads as a combat configuration. We go in quiet." Sumner turned back to the station. Cole watched the stars for another moment, then turned and walked toward the corridor that connected the bridge to the lower deck. He found Ambassador Gary Holt in the diplomatic bay, sitting at a long table with his case files spread out in front of him, and a cup of cold coffee at his elbow that he had clearly forgotten existed. Holt was a tall man, thin-faced, with a careful posture of someone who had spent decades sitting in rooms where posture was being evaluated. He had been Earth's diplomatic liaison to the Galactic Interspecies Council for 9 years, which meant he had spent 9 years being politely dismissed formally ignored, and seated behind glass in the lower gallery while species that had been traveling between stars for centuries talked about humanity as though it were a zoning problem. Cole had read Holt's file before the mission. He had expected to find someone who had gone small under that kind of treatment, someone who had learned to make himself comfortable with being minimized. Instead, he had found someone who had gone very, very still. Holt was like a person who had been pushing against a wall for so long that when the wall finally moved, he was going to keep pushing at exactly the same steady pace, because stopping now would be wrong, and he knew it. 12 hours, Cole said, sitting down across from him. Holt looked up. I know. He looked back down at the files. I've been going over the evidence package again. You've been going over it for 3 weeks. I know that too. Holt picked up the cold coffee, looked at it, and set it back down. Do you know what the council is going to say when I walk in? Before I even sit down? Before I open my mouth? Tell me. They are going to say that humanity's territorial violations in the Zephyrus corridor are well documented, and that the council takes a serious view of aggression against member species, and that the UEF's history of unilateral action makes this a pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident. Holt said it in a flat, practiced voice, like a man reciting something he had heard too many times. They say it every time. The specific charge changes. The structure of the sentence stays the same. And this time you have evidence that the charge is false. I have evidence that the vessel that struck the Keth monitoring infrastructure was running a spoofed human ID signal, that the actual drive signature does not match any vessel in Oath registry, and that the launch origin point falls within 60,000 kilometers of a shipyard registered to the Druin. Holt paused. Yes, I have evidence that the charge is false. Then you have everything you need. Holt looked at him. In a fair room, yes, in a room where I have been sitting behind glass for 9 years. The evidence is the beginning of the conversation, not the end of it. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You're not going to be sitting behind glass this time. Holt did not answer right away. He looked back at his files. The lights of the diplomatic bay were warm and steady, and the hum of the ship's systems moved through the floor beneath their feet like a slow breath. Outside, the stars waited. No, Holt said finally. I suppose I'm not. Cole left him there and took the secondary corridor toward the weapons bay. He knew what he was going to find before he found it, because he had already seen it twice since the mission started, and Diana Voss was the kind of person who did the same thing in the same way until the situation changed, and the situation had not changed yet. She was running a combat simulation on the secondary tactical screen, not the full system. That would have triggered a bridge alert, but the offline simulation module, which looked identical to the live system and ran the same scenarios. She had it set to a close-range engagement in a constrained space, multiple contacts, and she was running the response protocols with a quiet, focused attention of someone who was not doing this because she expected to use it. She was doing it because the movement helped her think. Cole stood in the doorway. Voss was 4-1, broad-shouldered, with dark hair pulled back tight in a way of standing at a console that suggested she was prepared to become part of the console if circumstances required it. She had been his executive officer for 2 years. Before that she had been tactical commander on the Ardennes, a mid-sized frigate, and before that she had done 3 tours in the border zones where the human territories met the outer edges of council-administered space. Her younger brother, a survey crew member named Peter Voss, had been aboard a civilian observation platform in the Zephyrus corridor 14 months ago when a vessel of unknown origin, the same vessel, Cole now knew, that the Council was blaming on humanity, had conducted a strike on a Keth monitoring station. Peter Voss had been in the wrong place. He had been working a 6-month contract, sending money home to his wife and their 2 kids in Portland, and then he had been in the wrong place. And now there were 2 kids in Portland who did not have a father anymore. Cole had not appointed Diana Voss to this mission because of her brother. He had appointed her because she was the best tactical officer in the fleet, and because this mission, whatever else it was also a military operation, and military operations require the best people. But he had thought about Peter Voss when he signed her assignment. He had thought about what it meant to bring her here, what she was carrying, and whether the weight of it would steady her or unbalance her. He had decided it would steady her. He had been right. Commander! She did not look up from the simulation. Commander Voss. He stepped into the bay. Holt asked me a question a few minutes ago. I want to ask it to you. Go ahead. Do you think this will change anything? She paused the simulation. The screen froze on a tactical grid, a ring of contacts around a central point, all of them angled inward. She looked at it for a second, then toned. Change what? The accusation. Whether the Council admits the charge is false. Whether they acknowledge that the border raid was done by the Druin and not by us. Whether any of this moves anything. Voss was quiet. She looked at the frozen screen, then at Cole. Honestly, I don't know. The Council has been running the same playbook for as long as humanity has had a seat in that room. Evidence hasn't moved them before. No, it hasn't. But before, we walked in with nothing behind us. Files and arguments and polite language. She looked at the screen again. Then she looked out the small viewport set into the bay wall, at the hard dark outside, at the fold corridor they were about to enter. This time is different. How? This time they are going to look at the evidence, and then they are going to look out the window. She paused. And then they are going to look at the evidence again, and it's going to look different than it did the first time. Cole nodded. That was the truth of it, stated as plainly as it could be stated. He had been carrying it for months and had never quite found the words for it, and Voss had done it in 2 sentences. Get some sleep before we fold, he said. I want you on the bridge when we come through. I'll be there. He was almost out of the doorway when she said, Commander. He stopped. My brother wasn't military. He wasn't making any kind of stand. He was just working. Cole waited. I want them to know that what happened to him wasn't small. I want them to sit in that hole and understand that it was not a small thing that happened, and that a person who was just working is not a small thing, and that we are not going to keep sitting behind glass and being told to write an apology check. She said it evenly, not with anger, or not only with anger, with something older than anger. With the weight of someone who has said a thing to herself so many times that it has worn smooth, like a stone carried in a pocket. That's all. That's enough, Cole said, and he left her there. The fold corridor transit took 11 hours. Most of the crew slept in shifts. The ship's systems ran quiet and steady. Cole spent 4 of those hours in his bunk staring at the ceiling and thinking about sequencing, the exact order in which things needed to happen when they came through on the other side, which things needed to be visible and which things needed to wait, what the first transmission should say and what it should not say. He slept for 3 hours. He was back on the bridge before they came through. On the other side of the corridor, at the Council station orbiting the dead star they called the Velian Expanse, a different morning was beginning. High Arbiter Veluin had been the presiding voice of the Galactic Interspecies Council for longer than most of the station's structural support beams had existed. He was very old and very certain, and the combination of those 2 things had produced in him a kind of permanent calm that people who worked with him sometimes mistook for wisdom. It was wisdom, sometimes. Other times it was a calm of a creature that had stopped being surprised by things because it had decided a long time ago that very little was worth being surprised about. He was reviewing the case file on humanity's alleged territorial incursion when his aide, a young member of his own species named Seal, came in and told him that the human delegation had entered the approach corridor. Good, Veluin said. He did not look up from the file. The advanced scouts had confirmed the vessel's signature, Seal said. They are having some difficulty with the read. Difficulty. The approach corridor creates interference near the threshold. The scout sensor resolution at that range is not precise. They know something is moving. The classification is incomplete. Veluin turned a page in the file. It will be a shuttle. The human delegation always travels by shuttle. They have no reason to send anything larger. He set the file down. What is the status of the session preparation? All 37 delegations have confirmed attendance. The lower gallery is prepared for the human representative. The formal charge document have been distributed to all member seats. Proceedings begin in 4 hours. Good. Veluin folded his hands. He had 4 hands, and when all 4 of them were folded together in that particular arrangement, it meant he was done with the subject at hand and wished to move on. His staff had learned the signal years ago. Seal recognized it and withdrew. Veluin looked at the file again. The charge was straightforward. A human vessel had struck Keth infrastructure in the Sephiroth corridor, injuring a Keth survey crew and destroying 2 monitoring stations. The Keth had filed a complaint within 48 hours of the incident. They had provided sensor records damage assessments and witness testimony from 3 surviving crew members. The case was well documented. He had seen 3 similar cases involving humanity in the past decade. In each case, the pattern was the same. Humanity had taken an action. The Council had filed a formal complaint. Humanity had sent a representative who offered an explanation. The Council had rejected the explanation as insufficient. Humanity had paid a reparations assessment, and the matter was resolved. The process took between 2 and 4 sessions. It was, in Veluan's estimation, a standard administrative function. The difference between managing humanity and managing a particularly independent border colony was mostly a matter of paperwork. He was not concerned. In the security control room 2 levels below the council chamber, the Keth commander assigned to station defense was going over the scanned data from his outpost ships and finding something that bothered him. The outpost ships were positioned along the standard approach vectors to the station, the lanes that registered diplomatic vessels use when coming in for council sessions. They were mid-range sensors, good enough for the job of identifying and clearing incoming traffic, and for the past several years they had never registered anything unusual. Today they were registering something unusual. The contact moving along the primary approach vector was enormous. The mass readings were wrong. Completely wrong. He had been working council security for 8 years and had processed hundreds of incoming vessels, and not one of them had returned mass readings like this. He checked the sensor calibration. The calibration was fine. He checked the atmospheric interference index for the approach corridor. Normal. He ran the reading a second time. The number did not change. He flagged the contact and sent an alert to his supervisor, a senior security officer named Bourvan, who had been in council security for longer than almost anyone and who had a reputation for being very hard to alarm. Bourvan reviewed the reading for about 30 seconds and then said that the fold transition point always produced anomalies in mass sensor data, and that the contact was almost certainly a human shuttle running through a particularly dense pocket of corridor interference, and that this reading would normalize once the vessel completed transit and cleared the threshold. He told the Keth commander to continue standard monitoring and notify him if the contact failed to normalize. The Keth commander said yes, sir, and went back to his station. He kept watching the readings. The contact did not normalize. In the council chamber, the session began. The room was large and circular, with a high arbiter's platform at the center and the member delegations arranged in tiers around it. Each species had its own section, designed to accommodate their particular physical requirements. The Keth sat in a section with elevated air pressure and amber lighting. The Druin required a temperature differential between floor and ceiling that the chamber's environmental systems maintained with some effort, and so on. 37 different sections for 37 different kinds of life, all arranged around a central platform where Veluan sat and presided over the business of the galaxy. The lower gallery was behind the main tiers, separated by a wall of clear material that served no acoustic purpose. Voices carried through it perfectly well, but served a very clear symbolic purpose. The species seated in the lower gallery were not members. They were attendees. They were permitted to observe and to speak when called upon, but they did not vote and they did not raise formal motions, and they did not sit at the same level as the species that ran things. Humanity had occupied one of the lower gallery sections at every council session it had ever attended. There were 12 seats behind the glass. Earth never needed more than 4. Veluan called the session to order and noted, without particular concern, that the lower gallery section reserved for the human delegation was empty. He assumed the shuttle was still in transit. He proceeded with preliminary items, a trade dispute between 2 member species, an environmental monitoring report from the outer territories, a formal acknowledgement of a new scientific survey completed in the neutral zone, and waited for the delegation to arrive. 20 minutes into the preliminary session, the lower gallery was still empty. Murmurs moved through the chamber. Not alarm murmurs, curious ones. Several delegates turned to look at the gallery. One of the Keth delegates leaned to a colleague and said something in a low voice. The Druin delegation, sitting in their temperature gradient section, remained perfectly still and said nothing, which was what the Druin generally did when they were paying close attention to something. Veluan paused. He looked at the lower gallery. He looked at Seal, who was standing at the edge of the platform. Seal checked a communication device and then looked up with an expression that Veluan did not immediately recognize. Seal said that the human vessel had not yet completed corridor transit. Veluan asked what was causing the delay. Seal said that the approach corridor was clear and that there was no delay. The vessel was still in transit. It was moving at a low speed. Veluan looked at the lower gallery again. He told Seal to find out what was happening and report back. Then he resumed the preliminary session, because the session would not run itself, and because he was not going to be disrupted by the late arrival of a diplomatic shuttle. The contact cleared the threshold 4 minutes later. It did not normalize. On the bridge of the Iron Meridian, the full transit ended with a particular sensation that Cole had never found a good word for, a kind of pressure behind the eyes that lasted about 3 seconds and then released, and the stars outside shifted from the featureless gray of corridor space to the specific, positioned stars of real space, and the navigation system locked its coordinates, and the ship was suddenly somewhere instead of nowhere. Cole was standing at the center of the bridge. Sumner was at her station. The rest of the bridge crew were at their posts, all of them quiet, all of them doing their jobs. The discipline was very good. It was always very good. But today there was an extra quality to it, the specific stillness of people who understood exactly what was happening and had decided that the correct response was to be as steady and professional as the situation required. "Position confirmed," said the navigation officer, Lieutenant Danny Ruiz. His voice was level. "We are on approach vector to the Council station. Distance, 4 to 2,000 kilometers. Council security fleet bearing." Cole asked. "Multiple contacts," Sumner said. Her fingers moved across her station. 4 to 2 vessels. Standard escort formation around the station. "They are scanning us." A pause. "They are scanning us a lot." Cole almost smiled. "What are they getting?" "Everything," she said. And then, very quietly, "Oh, they're getting everything." There was a moment on the bridge that was not quite silence and not quite noise. It was the sound of a breath being held, collectively, by a crew of 412 people distributed across decks and stations throughout a 4-kilometer warship, none of whom could actually know that the others were doing it, but all of whom were doing it anyway. 4 to 2 alien warships at a distance of 42,000 kilometers had just completed their first full scan of the Iron Meridian. Sumner began reading the results. 11 vessels breaking formation. Emergency power on 7 of them. Drives going hot. She read the numbers in the steady, clear voice she used for sensor reports, the same voice she might have used to read weather data or a routine equipment check. 3 vessels initiating weapons charging protocols. Charging has stopped. They are standing down. Formation is reforming. But, she paused, looking at the screen. "Sir, they are not going back to the original positions. They are spacing out. They are giving themselves room. They are treating us as a contact they need to track," said Chief Warrant Officer Greg Palmer from the tactical station, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes," Cole said. "They are." He turned to the communication station. "Open a channel to the station." The communications officer, a young woman named Specialist Tara Owens, looked up with the slightly wide eyes of someone doing their absolute best to appear professionally calm. "Channel open, so." Cole straightened. He put his hands behind his back. He thought, very briefly, about everything that had led to this moment. The 11 years of construction above Titan, the secrecy, the wake, Lou Garrett sitting down on the observation platform because what she had built was too large to stand in front of without needing to sit down. He thought about Gary Holt sitting at a table for 9 years with cold coffee and files and a wall of glass between him, and the room where decisions were made. He thought about Diana Voss in the weapons bay running simulations in the dark. He thought about Peter Voss, who had just been working. "This is Commander Nathan Cole of the United Earth Federation," he said. His voice was even and clear and carried the weight of a man who had nothing to apologize for. "I am the commanding officer of the UEF Iron Meridian, registered vessel of the United Earth Federation Navy, hull classification Titan class, commission number UETC 001. He paused one beat. "I am here as the escort and transport vessel for Ambassador Gary Holt, who is authorized to represent the United Earth Federation at today's council session. Ambassador Holt is prepared to address the council concerns in formal proceedings at the council's convenience." Another pause. "We are holding our current position. We are not a threat. We are waiting." He gave a small nod to Owens. She closed the channel. The bridge was quiet. Cole stood where he was and waited. The response took a long time. Long enough that Ruiz checked the channel status twice to confirm that the transmission had gone through. It had gone through. The station was simply not answering immediately. Cole used the time. He turned to Sumner. "Bring us around to present the forward profile to the station's primary sensor array." Sumner looked at him. "That puts our bow facing them directly." "Yes. That's going to be." She stopped. She understood. "Aye, sir. Forward profile to primary sensor array." The Iron Meridian moved. It was a slow movement, measured and controlled, with no aggression in it, just geometry, the ship rotating on its axis until the full length of its forward section were presented to the sensors on the Council station. The sensors that, even at this distance, were certainly transmitting everything they saw to screens inside that station, to screens in the Council chamber, to screens in front of 37 different delegations who had come here today expecting to sit in judgment of the small shuttle. Cole could not see the Council chamber from here. He did not need to. In the Council chamber, several things were happening at once. The chamber's main display screen, which occupied the upper section of the curved wall above the high arbiter's platform, had switched from its standard session feed to the external sensor view. No one had ordered this change. The station's automated systems had triggered it when the incoming contact exceeded the size threshold for standard diplomatic traffic. The threshold existed because Council engineers had designed it 20 years ago as a precaution, never seriously expecting it would be triggered. Every delegate in the room was looking at the screen. High Arbiter Veluin was looking at the screen. What they were seeing was this: a ship, a human ship, a ship that looked nothing like any human vessel any of them had ever seen or catalogued or imagined in their assessments of what humanity was capable of building. It was dark, with a matte black absorption coating that the Iron Meridian's hull carried to reduce its sensor cross-section, but at this distance and against the backdrop of the Veluin Expanse's dead star, the outline was clear and absolute. It was mountainous. It was a kind of shape that did not belong in space because space was infinite, and even the largest things in it were still small against the infinity. But this ship filled the sensor frame in a way that made the 42 vessels of the Council security fleet look like they had accidentally been photographed next to something they did not belong near. One of the delegates, an elder from a species called the Avari, who had been attending Council sessions for over 200 years and had watched the births and deaths of stars from observatory platforms above the oldest inhabited worlds in the galaxy, felt something happen in the region of its chest that it had not felt since it was very young. A tightening, a physical response to a visual input that the ancient brain did not have a word for in its current language, but that the deep, old part of every living thing has always had a word for. The word was, "That is bigger than me." The word was, "I am small." The Avari elder sat very still and breathed carefully and watched the screen. Veluin's feeding appendages retracted. It was an involuntary response, a physiological reaction in his species to acute stress, the biological equivalent of flinching. He had not done it in public in 40 years. He was aware that he was doing it now and could not stop it, and was therefore aware, on a level that bypassed all of his experience and certainty and calm, that what he was looking at had produced in him a response that nothing had produced in him in 40 years. He did not say anything for a long moment. Seal, at the edge of the platform, was staring at the screen with the wide, flat gaze of someone whose categories have just failed. The Keth security commander, watching from the security control room, had just received a new scan return on his screen. The mass readings were no longer anomalous. They were precise. They were the most precise readings his sensors had ever returned, because the contact was no longer at long range and no longer passing through corridor interference. The contact was right there, 42,000 kilometers out, sitting absolutely still, and every number his sensors were giving him was real. He read the numbers. He picked up his communication line to Borvan. He said, "Sir, I need you to come look at something." In the diplomatic bay of the Iron Meridian, Gary Holt was watching the Council chamber feed on the monitor mounted above the table. The station had automatically linked the external sensor display to its internal broadcast, which meant that every screen on every deck connected to the Council station's network was now showing the same image that the chamber wall was showing. Holt had not planned for this, but he was not unhappy about it. He was watching Veluin. He had worked with Veluin across 9 years and 3 formal sessions. He had sat behind glass while Veluin read charges against humanity in a voice that carried the mild impatience of a very senior administrator dealing with a routine problem. He had watched Veluin dismiss his responses, table his evidence requests, and schedule reparations assessments with the efficiency of a man who had done this before and expected to do it again. Veluan's feeding appendages were retracted. Holt had studied enough about Veluan species to know what that meant. He had studied it the same way he had studied everything about the Council over 9 years, carefully, patiently, building knowledge in the slow and methodical way of a person who understood that the only advantage he was likely to have in any room was knowing more about that room than the people who ran it. He watched Veluan on the screen for a moment. Then he straightened his collar. He gathered his files and put them in order: the sensor logs, the communication records, the flight path reconstruction, the shipyard registration data. He arranged them the way he always arranged them before a session, not by date, not by document type, but by argument. First the foundation, then the structure, then the roof. First what could not be argued, then what could only be argued with great difficulty, then what the evidence made undeniable. He was ready. He had been ready for 9 years. Cole's voice came over the diplomatic bay intercom. "Ambassador, the station has opened a return channel. They are asking for the shuttle to proceed to docking bay 7. "Thank you, Commander." Holt closed his case file. He picked it up. Cole was waiting for him in the shuttle bay. The bay was large and well-lit, and the shuttle sat on the launch pad looking small and practical and entirely unremarkable. A crew member was running final checks on the pre-launch systems. 2 more were standing by the boarding ramp. Everything was orderly and calm. Holt walked toward the shuttle. Cole fell into step beside him. "How did they take the transmission?" Holt asked. "They took a while to answer," Cole said. "That was the take." Holt almost smiled. They walked for a few steps in silence. Then Holt said, "You know that even with the Iron Meridian sitting out there, there's no guarantee they change anything. They have procedures. They have process. They can sit in that chamber and look at a warship through the window and still run the same routine they've always run." "I know. Fear doesn't automatically produce justice." "No," Cole agreed. "It produces attention. What you do with the attention is your part." They reached the foot of the boarding ramp. Holt stopped and looked at Cole. "Do you think it's enough? What we've done today, just showing up like this, do you think it actually moves anything that matters?" Cole was quiet for a moment. He thought about what Diana Voss had said in the weapons bay, about looking at evidence and then looking out the window and then looking at the evidence again. He thought about how the same information looks different depending on who you are standing next to when you read it. "I think," he said carefully, "that today is the last day we walk into that room as something they don't have to take seriously. Whatever they decide, whatever they say, after today, we are something different in their heads than we were yesterday. That's not the end of anything. It's not even close to the end, but it's a line, and getting to the other side of a line matters." He paused, "Even if what's on the other side is just more work." Holt nodded slowly. He looked at the shuttle. He looked at Cole. "I'll do my job," he said. "I know you will." Holt walked up the ramp. The crew member at the top acknowledged him and secured the hatch. Cole stepped back as the launch systems ran their final sequence. The bay doors opened, and through them, if you stood at the right angle, you could see the Council station, a cluster of lights at this distance, small and precise, like a machine built by someone very careful. The shuttle lifted off the pad, moved forward on its guidance system, and passed through the bay doors into open space. Cole watched it go. He stood there alone in the bay for a moment after the shuttle had cleared the ship. Through the open bay doors the view was open and enormous. The dead star of the Velian expanse off to the left, casting a dim reddish light that was not quite enough to see by, and the Council station ahead with its small precise lights, and between them the tiny bright shape of the shuttle making its way across the gap. Cole's earpiece clicked. Sumner's voice came through. "Sir, you're going to want to hear this." He touched the earpiece. "Go ahead." "I've been tracking the Council security fleet's formation changes since we arrived. I've been calling it repositioning. They kept adjusting their spacing, spreading out, giving themselves room." A brief pause. "I just ran the final geometry on their current positions. And all 42 vessels are now fully oriented toward us. Not pointed at us, faced toward us, watching us." Another pause. "The formation they are holding right now. It looks like," Sumner stopped for a moment. "So, it looks like a guard of honor." Cole looked out through the bay doors at the open black. "Somewhere out there, At the edge of sensor range, 42 ships from 42 different worlds were facing his ship, watching it, not because they had been ordered to, not as a tactical response, because the thing in front of them was the kind of thing that you turn to face. Because something in the living brain, even an alien living brain, responds to a certain scale of existence by giving it its full attention. He did not say anything to Sumner. He looked at the shuttle, still crossing, still moving, small and bright and steady against the dark. He thought about Gary Holt, sitting in that shuttle with his files in order and his collar straight, crossing the gap between the biggest human thing ever built and the room that had never taken humanity seriously. He thought, go do your job. He thought, we gave you the only thing we could give you. The rest is yours. Cole put his hands behind his back and watched the shuttle until it was too small to see. Then he turned and walked back through the bay and took the corridor toward the bridge, and the Iron Meridian held its position in the cold and the silence and the watching eyes of 42 ships, absolutely still, waiting. The shuttle docked at Base 7 without ceremony. There was no one waiting for Gary Holt at the docking arm. No steward, no formal escort, no council aide holding a sign with his name on it. In the 3 previous sessions he had attended at this station, there had always been someone waiting to walk him to the lower gallery. The walk itself had never taken more than 5 minutes, and the person doing the walking had always been polite in the particular way that people are polite when they are moving you toward a place they have already decided you belong. This time the docking arm was empty. Holt stood at the end of the arm with his case files under one arm and looked at the corridor ahead of him. The station's interior lights were warm and steady. The corridor was wide enough for 3 people to walk side by side, and the walls were lined with a kind of clean, neutral material that said, this place was designed for many different kinds of life, and none of them are more important than the others. He had always found that particular design philosophy interesting, given everything that happened inside the rooms it was supposed to be neutral about. He had been standing there for about 30 seconds when a steward arrived. Not hurrying, but moving with the careful speed of someone who was aware they were late and did not want it to be obvious. The steward was a young member of a species called a Merith, small, quick-eyed, with a silver culling of a young adult. The Merith worked in council administration because they were good at logistics and because they could move through a station corridor faster than almost any other species without appearing to run. The steward stopped in front of Holt and said, in the common trade language that all registered species use for official communication, that it was honored to escort the human ambassador to the session. Holt said thank you. He followed the steward. The corridor they walked through was longer than the one he normally used. Holt noticed this after the first 2 turns. They were taking a different route than the lower gallery access corridor. He did not say anything about it. He watched the path and kept walking. They came to the main chamber level. The steward paused at a set of double doors that Holt recognized as a primary floor access, the entry used by member delegations, not by gallery observers. The steward touched the door panel, and the doors slid open, and Holt understood. He took one breath. He straightened his jacket. He walked through. The council chamber was fully attended. All 37 delegations were in their sections, and the moment the doors opened, the room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something has entered that everyone was already thinking about. Holt felt the attention land on him the way you feel warm air when you step outside. It was present, physical, and it came from every direction at once. He was on the main floor, not behind the glass, not in the lower gallery. He was standing at the same level as the member delegations, on the same floor, under the same lights, and there was a seat for him at the presentation position directly in front of the High Arbiter's platform, the seat used by member representatives when they addressed a full session. The steward led him to it. He sat down. He set his case files on the table. High Arbiter Veluan was on the platform above him, and even from below, Holt could see that the old Arbiter had recovered a degree of his normal composure. The feeding appendages were visible again, present, still, controlled. The face carried the expression of someone who was working. The hands, all 4 of them, were folded in the arrangement that Holt had learned years ago meant the subject is closed and we will move forward. Veluan used that gesture like a door. Right now the door was closed, and what was behind it was whatever he had felt when the Iron Meridian came through that fold. Holt looked at him steadily. He had nothing against Veluan personally. He had never had anything against Veluan personally. What he had against Veluin was the 9 years of small and quiet and consistent messaging that humanity was a problem to be managed rather than a people to be dealt with, and the fact that Veluin had never done this with cruelty, had always done it with a kind of impersonal efficiency that made it harder to argue with, because you couldn't point at it and say that was wrong. You could only point at the effect of it, which was a lower gallery behind glass, and a species that had been traveling between stars for 2 generations being told, session after session, that it sat at the back of the room. Veluin opened the session. His voice was its usual precise, measured instrument. He noted that the session was continuing from the preliminary period, that all member delegations were present, and that the formal charge against the United Earth Federation was now to be heard. He read the charge, the same language, the same structure of sentence that Holt had described to Cole the night before. The Keth infrastructure, the survey crew, the unauthorized military activity in the Sephirus corridor. He read it without inflection. Then he looked down at Holt and said that the Council called on the representative of the United Earth Federation to respond to the charges presented. Holt opened his case file. He did not start with a response. He started with something that he had not planned to say out loud, and he said it in the quiet way of a man who is not performing it, just stating it. He said that before he began, he wanted to note that he had attended 3 previous sessions in this chamber, and had always done so from the lower gallery, and that he appreciated the Council's decision to receive him on the main floor today. He said it without sarcasm and without gratitude. He said it as a fact that had been noted, like a change in the weather. Then he moved on. He put the first document on the table. The charge states that a human vessel struck the Keth monitoring stations at coordinate 7 Alpha and 7 Alpha 2 in the Sephirus corridor on the 14th of last month, Holt said. I am going to present evidence that the vessel which conducted that strike was not a human vessel. I am going to do this in 3 steps, and I ask that each step be received and formally entered into session record before I move to the next. Veluin said that the Council would receive the evidence as presented. Holt put the sensor log on the display screen. It was a capture from an independent relay station position at the edge of the Sephirus corridor, not a human relay, not a Council relay, but a commercial relay operated by a species called the Tess, who ran cargo and communication services in the outer territories and had no political relationship with either Earth or the Council. The relay had logged the approach, arrival, and departure of the vessel that hit the stations. The log was 90 seconds of data. Holt walked through it carefully. He noted the drive signature, which was a specific way a ship's propulsion system burns and moves and leaves a trace in space. Every ship burns differently. Not very differently, but differently enough that sensor technology could read the difference if it was paying attention. The vessel in the test relay log had a drive signature that was, in the plain technical language of propulsion engineering, wrong for a human ship. The burn pattern was wrong. The energy dispersion curve was wrong. The ion residue left behind as the ship moved was a wrong composition. Holt had a chart. The chart showed, side by side, the drive signature of the vessel in the relay log, and the drive signature of every class of ship in the United Earth Federation Navy Registry, including ships from 15 years back that were no longer in service. Not one of them matched. The methodology of the comparison had been conducted by 3 independent analysts, 1 human, 1 from a neutral species called the Vori, 1 from the Keth themselves, from the Civilian Engineering Division, not the military side. He put all 3 analyst names and credentials on the screen. He waited while Veluin reviewed them. The chamber was very quiet. Veluin said that the first submission was received and entered into record. Holt put the second document on the display. The second document was a communication intercept. It was not a human intercept. Holt had been careful about this, because he knew that anything gathered by human intelligence would be questioned, and he needed the chain of evidence to be clean. The intercept had been pulled from the Outer Territory Monitoring Network by a private security firm that worked for a coalition of commercial shipping companies who operated in the Sephirus region. The shipping companies had commissioned the monitoring after the strike on the Keth stations because the strike had disrupted their routes and they wanted to know if the area was safe to resume operations. In the process of their monitoring, the security firm systems had logged a brief encrypted communication between 2 points in the outer territories. The communication itself could not be decrypted. Holt was not claiming to know what it said. What he was presenting was the 2 points of communication travel between, the origin and the destination, and what those 2 points were. The origin point was in the outer territories, in a region of space that had no official registration and no named coordinates in the Council's standard charts. Holt had the coordinates. He read them into the record. The destination was a location in Council-administered space. Holt had those coordinates as well. He read them. He then asked the Council's records clerk, the permanent staff member whose job was to maintain the Council's registry of registered facilities, stations, and installations, to pull the registration record for the destination coordinates. There was a pause. The clerk checked the registry. The clerk looked at the screen. The clerk looked at Veluin. Veluin looked at the clerk. The clerk said that the destination coordinates corresponded to a commercial shipyard registered under the name of a species called the Druin in the outer section of the Council-administered territory. The chamber was no longer just quiet. It was the kind of quiet that has weight. Holt said he would like that registration record entered into the session record as well. Veluin said it would be entered. Holt put the third document on the display. The third document was the flight path reconstruction. It had been built from 4 separate data sources: the test relay log, 2 additional commercial relay captures that Holt's team had located in the weeks after the strike, and a gravitational drift analysis conducted by a physics team at the University of New Melbourne. The reconstruction showed where the attacking vessel had come from, the path it had traveled to reach the Keth stations, and the path it had taken after the strike to return to its point of origin. The path of origin and the path of return both traced to the same general region of space. Not exactly to the coordinates of the Druin shipyard. The reconstruction was not precise enough to make that claim, and Holt was not going to make a claim his evidence didn't support. But the region was the same region. The flight paths passed through the same region. The communication intercept had originated from the same region. 3 separate data sources, gathered by 3 separate parties with no connection to each other and no connection to humanity, all pointing to the same place. Holt put his hands flat on the table. He looked up at Veluin. He said, "I am not accusing anyone. I am presenting what the evidence shows. The vessel that struck the Keth stations was not a human vessel. The evidence of origin points toward the Druin shipyard registered to the Council under the coordinates I have entered into record. I am asking the Council to initiate an independent review of the Druin shipyard records, including production logs and vessel deployment records, for the period covering the 14 days before and after the strike." He sat back. He was done. The silence lasted for about 8 seconds. Holt counted them. Then 2 things happened almost simultaneously. One of the Council's founding member delegations, a species called the Sulith, who had been among the original architects of the Council 300 years ago and who had a long history of close political relationships with the Druin, raised a formal objection. The lead delegate, a senior member named Orvis, said that the evidence it presented was circumstantial and that coincidental proximity of origin coordinates did not constitute proof of involvement. He said that the communication intercept was unverifiable and that its inclusion in the session record was procedurally questionable. He said this in the measured language of someone who had been in council chambers for a long time and knew exactly which words had formal weight. At the same time, the lead delegate from a species called the Yeneri, a smaller species, one of the newer members of the council, a people who had spent most of their membership in the lower tiers of council procedure, being politely moved around by the founding members, raised her own voice and asked that the session be paused for a formal data review. She asked that the Druin shipyard registry record be pulled immediately and held for independent analysis. She used careful language, the language of procedure, but the direction she was pointing was not the same direction Orvis was pointing. A third delegation, the Pavi, seconded the Yeneri request. A fourth, the Hesseni, seconded it as well. Veluin held up 2 of his 4 hands. The chamber went quiet again. He sat with a posture of someone who was not going to be moved by any of this faster than he intended to move, and he said that the council would take a formal recess of the review of submitted materials, and that the session would resume in 40 minutes. The gavel came down. Holt stayed in his seat for a moment while the chamber filled with movement, delegates conferring, aides moving, the low sound of many different species having many different conversations in many different languages. He watched the room. He had been watching rooms like this for 9 years, learning them the way you learn a complicated machine, not by reading the manual, but by standing next to it while it ran and paying attention to what the sounds meant. He stood up, collected his files, and walked to the edge of the chamber where a wide viewport looked out into the dark. He could see the Iron Meridian from here. It was far enough away that it was a shape rather than a detail, a dark horizontal mass against the dim red light of the dead star, larger in its outline than anything nearby, but sitting with the specific stillness of a ship that had no reason to move and intended to demonstrate this. 4 to 2 smaller shapes were arranged around it in a loose pattern that, even at this distance, had a particular quality to it. Not a threat circle, not a blockade formation. Something else. A council security officer appeared at his elbow. Not Bourvan, a younger officer, one Holt did not recognize, wearing the standard security uniform and carrying himself with the careful neutrality of someone who had a question he was not sure he was supposed to ask. The officer asked, in the trade language, whether the human warship had weapons capable of engaging the station. Holt looked at him. He said yes. The officer was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if the ship had orders to use those weapons. Holt said no. He looked back out the viewport. He said, "We did not bring that ship here to threaten anyone. We built it, and we brought it because for 9 years, every time a human being sat down in one of those chairs in there, the people across the table had already decided what the conversation was going to be before it started. Not because of what we said, not because of what we did, because of what we were, because of how much space we took up in their thinking." He paused. We wanted to take up a different amount of space. The officer looked at the viewport. He was quiet long enough that Holt thought the conversation was over. Then the officer said, quietly, "I understand." He moved away. Holt stayed at the viewport. On the Iron Meridian, in the weapons bay where the secondary tactical screens ran alongside the main armament monitoring systems, Diana Voss heard Holt's transmission summary through the audio feed that Sumner had routed to the ship's internal communications network. Sumner had done this without being asked. She had routed the council session audio the moment the shuttle docked, because she understood that the crew had a right to hear what was happening in that room, and also because she was Sumner, and Sumner believed that information was better distributed than held. Voss had been in the weapons bay since the shuttle launched. She had not run any more simulations. She was just present, standing near the monitoring console, listening. When Holt began his evidence presentation, she had pulled up the second seat of the console and sat down in it, and she had listened to every word. She heard the drive signature analysis. She heard the communication intercept coordinates. She heard the flight path reconstruction and the Druin shipyard registry and the 4 delegations seconding the data review request and the recess being called. When the audio went quiet for the recess, the weapons bay was also quiet. Petty Officer Second Class Liu Kim, 23 years old and 18 months into his first deep space posting, was at the station next to Voss. He had joined the Navy from Seattle, had wanted to serve since he was 12 years old, and had been standing watching the weapons bay for the past 6 hours without a word from anyone about what was happening outside. He had been listening to the feed with the careful attention of someone filing things away. He said, not really to Voss and not really to himself, "Do you think they're going to do it? Actually review the shipyard records." Voss thought about it. She thought about Orvis's objection, which had been smooth and fast in practice, the objection of a delegate who had used that exact language before and knew exactly what it was worth procedurally. She thought about the Yeneri delegates counter, which had been less smooth but had picked up 3 seconds because 3 other delegations had been waiting for someone to say it. She thought about 40 years of working the same process in the same room, and how patterns were hard to break, even when the reasons for the pattern were no longer what they used to be. "They'll review," she said. "Whether they admit what the review shows them is a different question." Kim nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is it enough? Getting them to look at it, even if they don't say it out loud?" Voss looked at the console. She was thinking about Peter, not thinking about him in the way of grief, not the sharp kind. She had done most of that in the first weeks, in private, in the hour between shifts when there was nothing to do but sit with it. She was thinking about him in the way you think about someone when you are in the middle of something that matters and you want them to know about it. She was thinking about the fact that he had been working, just working, and that the thing that had happened to him had been treated, for 14 months, as something that needed to be administered and processed and filed away, and that today was the first day that was changing. Getting them to look at it honestly, she said, is the entire point. Everything else follows from that, or it doesn't. But you can't get to what comes after if you don't get past the part where they're still pretending there's nothing to see. Kim seemed to consider this. Then he said quietly, "Yes, He turned back to his station. Voss stayed where she was. She did not say Peter's name out loud. She did not need to. The council session resumed in 43 minutes, 3 minutes past the scheduled recess. Holt was back at the presentation seat when the delegates returned. He noticed the quality of the chamber's movement during the return, who sat down quickly, who stood talking to their aides until the last moment, which delegations clustered together and which ones moved separately to their seats. Orvis of the Solith delegation sat down with the composure of a person who had used a recess well. His aide was seated beside him and was not looking at anything in particular, which meant they had discussed everything that needed to be discussed and were now simply waiting for what came next. The Yeneri delegate, whose name was Henri and who was 40 years younger than Orvis and who had the controlled energy of someone who had made a decision during the recess and was not going back from it, sat down with her files arranged differently than they had been before the break. She had brought something new to the table. Veluan took his platform and called the session back to order. He said that the council had reviewed the submitted evidence during the recess and that the formal data review of submitted materials was complete. He said that the council's records office had confirmed the Druin shipyard registration, and that the registry documentation was now formally in the session record. He said this without any particular emphasis, in the same even voice he used for all procedural items. Then he said that based on the evidence as entered, the Council's formal position was that the charges against the United Earth Federation were suspended pending independent investigation. Holt did not move. Suspended pending independent investigation. He knew what that meant. It was not an exoneration. It was not an apology. It was a Council's procedure for acknowledging that the evidence before it was not sufficient to proceed with the original charge, while stopping well short of saying that the original charge had been wrong. It was careful language. It was a language of an institution that had never admitted an error cleanly in its entire 300-year history, and was not going to start today, and was doing the next closest thing. Orvis immediately registered a formal objection to the suspension language, calling it premature given the unverified nature of the intercept data. Henri of the Yeneri immediately called a vote on the suspension. Votes in the council required a 2/3 majority. The vote ran through the chamber's electronic system, which posted the results on the main display in real time. The founding member bloc, the Solith, the Druin's own seated delegation, and 2 others voted against the suspension. The remaining 33 delegations, to varying degrees of enthusiasm, voted for it. The suspension passed. Veluan noted the result, entered it into the session record, and then did something that was not in the formal procedure. He said that the Council, in recognition of the character of today's proceedings, wished to formally note the presence of the United Earth Federation's military vessel in the outer approach zone, and to recognize the United Earth Federation as a recognized strategic presence in the Council proceedings, pending the outcome of the independent investigation. Recognized strategic presence. It was 4 words. In the Council's 300 years of operation, those 4 words had been applied to non-founding member species exactly twice, and both times it had taken decades of negotiation to arrive at them. Veluan had just said them in the middle of a regular session, without negotiation, without formal motion, as though they were a simple statement of fact. Because they were a simple statement of fact. The Iron Meridian was 42,000 kilometers away. Everyone in the room knew it was there. Recognized strategic presence was what you called a thing when you could no longer talk around it. Holt said thank you. He asked for formal documentation of the suspension and the recognition to be transmitted to the United Earth Federation government. Veluan said it would be done before the end of the day's session. The gavel came down. The session was over. Holt did not get up right away. He sat at the presentation seat with his files in front of him and the chamber moving around him, delegates leaving, aide collecting materials, the stewards beginning the process of resetting the room for whatever came next, and he sat with a particular stillness of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has just set it down and is not entirely sure yet what to do with empty hands. He had not gotten an apology. He had not gotten a full admission of error. What he had gotten was the Council's own record showing a false charge suspended, and 4 words at change, in permanent and official terms, what humanity was in the room where the galaxy managed its business. It was not enough. He knew that. It was the beginning of enough, which was different. Henri of the Yeneri appeared beside him as he was gathering his files. She was small. Her species was generally small, with a careful, direct way of looking at things that characterized her people. She said, in the trade language, that she thought the evidence had been well organized and clearly presented. Holt said thank you. She said she had voted for the suspension because the evidence was correct, not because of the ship outside. Holt looked at her. He said he understood. She said, but the ship outside is why the vote went 29-4 instead of 7-26. She said this without judgment, just as information, the way she might pass him a document. You should know that. It matters for what you do next. I know, Holt said. She nodded once and moved away. Holt watched her go. The shuttle back to the Iron Meridian was quiet. Holt sat alone in the passenger section with his files on his lap and watched the council station shrink in the porthole as the shuttle moved away from the docking arm. The station's lights were small and steady in the dark, the lights of 37 civilizations going about their evening routines, filing their session reports, updating their governments, beginning the process of reacting to a day that none of them had expected. He thought about what Henri had said. He thought about the difference between being right and being heard. He thought about the 9 years it had taken to get to a room where one was more likely to produce the other. The shuttle crossed the open space between the station and the ship. He watched it get bigger. He watched the Iron Meridian resolve from a shape into a presence, the detail of the hull coming into focus, the scale of it re-establishing itself in the way it always did when you approached it from outside, which was the only way to actually understand what it was. From inside, it was a ship. From outside, it was something else. It was a statement a civilization makes when it decides it has been patient long enough and has the will and the industry to say so in a language that does not require translation. Cole was waiting in the shuttle bay. He was alone, standing at the base of the boarding ramp with his hands at his sides and the patient posture of a man who did not need to fill waiting with movement. The bay was quiet. The launch crew had cleared out, leaving the two of them in the large, well-lit space with the hum of the ship's systems moving through the floor. Holt came down the ramp. He stopped at the bottom and looked at Cole. Cole said, "How did it go?" Holt set his case file down on the equipment rack beside the ramp. He thought for a moment about how to answer that. He thought about the suspended charges and the 4 words, and Henri's clear, careful observation about the vote count. He thought about Veluin's feeding appendages and Orvis's polished objection, and the Yeneri delegates' files rearranged during the recess. He said, "They didn't give us an apology. They didn't say they were wrong out loud. What they gave us was a charge suspended in the record, an independent investigation ordered, and 4 words that have never been applied to a non-founding member before." Cole looked at him. What 4 words? Recognize strategic presence. Cole was quiet for a moment. He said, "In the official session record, read into the record by the High Arbiter, will be transmitted to our government with the suspension documentation by end of day." Cole was quiet again, for longer this time. He had the look of a man who is turning something over carefully, checking every side of it. They treated a human representative like someone whose next move actually mattered. Holt said, "They argued. The founding bloc fought it. The smaller delegations pushed back, and the vote was 29-4. And after 9 years sitting behind glass, I was in the main room, at the main table, and the evidence I put on that screen was taken seriously because they could not afford to treat it the way they treated everything else we've ever brought in." He paused. "I know what made the difference. I'm not pretending it was just the argument." "No," Cole said. "It was both." "It was both?" Holt agreed. They stood for a moment in the quiet of the bay. Then Cole said, "What comes next?" Holt picked up his files. He thought about Henri. He thought about the vote count. He thought about what you do with a room that has just shifted its weight and has not yet settled into its new position. The investigation. And we watch it carefully because the Druin shipyard connection is real and the founding bloc knows it, and they are going to spend the next several months working out how to manage the implications of that. He looked at Cole. "And we watch who calls us. After today. Who from the council wants a conversation that wasn't on the schedule before we arrived." Cole nodded slowly. That was the work. Not the moment, but the long process that the moment had made possible. "The ship turns around and goes home," Cole said, "and we figure out what to do with the space we cleared." "That's about right," Holt said. He headed toward the corridor. Cole watched him go for a moment, then turned and took the route to the bridge. Diana Voss was already there. She was standing at the tactical station, reviewing the security fleet formation data that Sumner had been updating throughout the session. She looked up when Cole came through the bridge door. She had heard the transmission. He could see that in her face, not the relief of someone who had gotten what they wanted, but the specific, quiet expression of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and is learning, slowly, how to carry it differently. Cole came to stand beside her at the station. He looked at the formation data on the screen. 4-2 ships, still oriented toward the Iron Meridian, the geometry of their positions unchanged since Sumner had first identified it as a guard of honor. He did well, Voss said. He did very well. She was quiet for a moment. Then, 4 words. 4 words. She looked at the data. My brother worked 3 contracts before the Zephyrus one. He did 2 years on a freight run in the inner belt, then a season on a survey platform above Kepler's third moon, then the Zephyrus contract. She said this without any particular emphasis, just setting it down in the space between them. He told me after the second contract that he was thinking about getting a shore job. He said deep space work was getting old. But the Zephyrus contract paid well and the hours were short, and he thought it would be a quick one. She stopped. I told him to take it. Cole did not say anything. I've thought about that a lot, she said. Whether it matters, whether the fact that I told him to take it changes what happened, or changes what it means, or whether it's just something that sits there. She looked at the screen. What happened today doesn't change it. It doesn't fix it. Nothing today is about that. No, Cole said quietly. It's not. But it means that the people who let it get filed away and paid out as a reparations line item had to sit in a room today and look at evidence they couldn't refuse to look at. They had to do it because the words didn't work anymore, and the reason the words stopped working is sitting outside their windows right now. She paused. Peter would have thought that was funny. He had a good sense of humor about big things. Cole looked at her. He wanted to say something that was equal to what she had just said, and he could not find it, so he said the only thing that was true. He said, he mattered. What happened to him mattered. The people in that room know it now in a way they didn't before today. Voss nodded once. She turned back to the station. Sumner, she said. Sumner looked up from the sensor panel. Commander, what's the current status of the security fleet? Sumner checked. Still facing us. Formation unchanged. A short pause. No movement toward or away. They are stationary, fully oriented our way. She looked at the screen, then at Voss. They've been like this for 3 hours and 12 minutes. Voss said, log it. She looked at Cole. That gets logged and transmitted with the session documentation. Cole said that was correct. Then he stepped past her to the main viewport and stood in front of it, looking out at the space that held all of this, the station behind him, the dead star to the left, the security fleet arranged in their long patient watch, and beyond them the open dark that was full of other stars and other worlds and other species who would hear about today before long. He stood there for a while. He was not thinking about the next mission or the next political step or the Council's independent investigation. He was doing something he did not do often, which was simply standing in place and letting the weight of it be what it was, without moving through it toward whatever came next. What had happened today was not the end of something. He had told Holt that. He believed it. But it was also not nothing, and the temptation in his life had always been to move so quickly from one thing to the next that the things in between got compressed into summary, and the summary was never the same as the experience, and eventually you had a career instead of a life. He did not want a career instead of life. He wanted to stand at this viewport for 5 minutes and know, with the full weight of his experience, what had been done here today and what it had cost to do it and what it was worth. It was worth a great deal. Not because the Council had given 4 words and suspended charge, though those things had value, but because the way those things had been given was different from the way anything had ever been given to humanity in that room before. It had been given in response to argument and evidence and presence, the specific combination of those 3 things, all arriving at the same time in the same place. The argument Holt had carried for 9 years. The evidence the dead had provided, in the records of what had actually happened to them. The presence was a ship. The presence was a work of 11 years and the cold coffee and the late shifts and Lou Garrett sitting down on the platform and everyone who had built the thing that was now sitting outside the windows of a council chamber that had never expected to look at it. Cole put his hands behind his back. He breathed in. He looked at the stars for a while. Sumner's voice came from across the bridge, even and professional as always. "Commander, navigation is ready for the full course home, when you give the order." Cole looked at the viewport one more time. He thought about what was back there on the other side of the fold, Earth, and the shipyard above Titan, and the people who were waiting to hear what had happened, and the long and complicated work that was going to follow from what had happened. He thought about all of it, and all of it was real, and all of it was going to require the same kind of steadiness that had gotten them here. He turned from the viewport. "Plot the full course home," he said. Sumner entered the command. Navigation confirmed the lock. The course was set. The Iron Meridian began its slow tone, the massive ship rotating with the deliberate patience of a thing that moved on its own terms, not because it was in a hurry but because it had decided to move. The Council station shifted in the viewport, moving from the center of the view to the left and then to the edge and then behind them, its light shrinking as the distance opened. The security fleet, all 4-2 ships, held their positions. As the Iron Meridian toned and began its approach to the fold corridor, the formation of the 4-2 ships did not change. They stayed where they were, watching, facing the direction the human ship was going as though they intended to keep their eyes on it for as long as it was visible. Sumner noted this in the log, as Voss had instructed. It was entered into the mission record at 1422 hours, session day 1. No one on the bridge said anything for a while. The ship moved. The stars moved around it in the slow, deep way that stars move when you are traveling at real space speed toward a fold threshold, everything shifting by fractions. Voss was at the tactical station. She was not running simulations. She was watching the navigation track on the secondary screen, the bright line of the course home tracing forward through the display, steady and clear. Holt was in the diplomatic bay, sitting at the table with his files closed and his coffee cup, a new one, hot this time, in his hands. He was not reviewing anything. He was just sitting, which was something he was not very good at and was going to try to practice more. Cole stood in the center of the bridge and watched his ship find its way to the fold point, and then he watched the fold open and take them through, and then the stars outside with a gray non-color corridor space, and they were on their way home. The Iron Meridian traveled through the fold corridor toward Earth, and behind it, the Council station orbited the dead star of the Velian expanse with 4-2 security ships still facing the direction it had gone, as though they were waiting for it to come back. It would come back. Not soon, and not in the way that the Council was thinking about in their chambers right now. But it would come back, because the kind of thing that had happened today does not happen once and then stop. It opens a door that has always existed but was never opened before. And once a door is open, the question is never whether anyone will walk through it again. The question is only what they will bring with them when they do. On the bridge, the fold corridor stretched around them in every direction, gray and vast and quiet. Cole looked at it. He thought it looked like the space between one thing and the next, between what humanity had been in the galaxy and what it was going to become. He thought it looked exactly like the right place to be.